Today we are going to talk about trauma's impact on the brain and how that teaches us how trauma is a body experience or a sensory experience. So the thing that I think helps the most to describe this is to think about the differences between what acute stress is and post-traumatic stress is. And the best way I have come up with to describe this is to think about when you are driving and maybe it's an icy or slippery day, and you're driving and you almost rear end the car in front of you. So you don't actually get into an accident, but you almost rear end the car in front of you. And you think about, for a second, if you think to a situation where that's ever happened to you, what your body experiences when you almost run into a car in front of you. And I know most people will say that they start to get shaky, they get really nervous. Some people say that they sweat. Some people say that they slammed on the brake really fast. The object of what we want to get at is that your body responds without you thinking about it, right? Your body is trying to protect itself from impending danger, or it's trying to protect your car, right? So that is what happens when your body is under acute stress. Those are things that we don't even think about. Your body takes care of those things for you. Those things are really regulated by the deepest part of your brain, which is called your brainstem. So when you have that acute stress response and you almost rear end the car in front of you, you're very relieved that you didn't rear end the car in front of you, and let's say you're on your way to work and you get to work. And how do you feel when you get to work if you've had a particularly kind of icy drive where there was a near-miss accident? You get into work and you might be a little bit stressed. You might think, oh my gosh, that was a really stressful drive to work. I need to get a coffee. I need to tell a friend. I'm skipping my breakfast and I'm going straight for chocolate. That is an acute stress response, and that is a normal response to a stressful situation that we have. Lots of people have, maybe a couple times a year, especially if you live in a state where there's snow. So when you get to work and you engage in those activities that help you calm down, hopefully your stress level begins to calm down too, right? You have kind of a surge in adrenaline when you almost rear end the car, and when you get to the place of safety, you calm down. Now, if you're looking out the window all day when you're at work and you see that the snow and the sleet is still coming down, and you go to get in your car for that drive home, what's going to happen to your body? You're going to remember the drive in the morning, and you're going to be what? You're going to be more cautious, more alert. You're probably going to drive a little bit slower. You're not going to have the radio blaring. You probably won't make a phone call. You're going to really do what you can to make sure that whatever happened this morning doesn't happen again, right? But if the snow has cleared up and you're looking out the window and it's bright and sunny and the roads are clear, you're going to sail home without much stress. That is kind of how an acute stress response works, when you have an acute response to stress that comes way up and then it comes down naturally how it could have or how it should have come down. So what happens with post-traumatic stress, or what is post-traumatic stress? Post-traumatic stress is essentially the same thing as acute stress, but when we are experiencing something that causes that surge in stress or that surge in adrenaline, it doesn't come back down like we want it to, or it doesn't come back down to the place where it should come back down to, because maybe we never get to a place of safety, or a place where we're able to tell a coworker what happened, but now we're safe and sound at our office and we can feel like we can take a deep breath. So two things typically happen with post-traumatic stress, and either it's that response is so significant and so severe because what the person experienced is so significant or terrorizing that that person gets stuck in the acute stress response and they stay up in that response. So remember, when we almost rear end the car in front of us, what our body is experiencing. It's the tense muscles, it's the sweatiness, the shaky, the nervous, the worry that what is happening is going to be significantly dangerous to our life or our safety or our survival. When that acute stress is prolonged and exaggerated for a significant amount of time, that's what we call post-traumatic stress. So it's the same response as the acute stress response in terms of how our body experiences it. It just doesn't go away. The second thing that can happen is that maybe a person has an experience where they have an experience of something very, very stressful, and they go up into the acute stress response, and then their body comes back down because they're feeling safe again. So let's say, for example, a child in the morning at home witnesses their parents fighting significantly, and they experience a surge in the stress hormone, and they're kind of up in that acute stress response. But then they go to school and they have a teacher that they really like and friends that they really like, and they really feel safe in the school setting. That stress response comes back down. But then when they go home again that night, or maybe a couple days later, they witness their parents arguing or fighting again. So they pop back up into the acute stress response. So you can see that any significant time that's exaggerated or prolonged in that surge of stress or adrenaline creates the stress response, and over time, that's what we would call post-traumatic stress. So the indicator that we use is typically if a person is in that acute stress response for more than 4 to 6 weeks, that is what we call post-traumatic stress. So it doesn't matter if it's because of one experience that was so significant that it got them stuck there, or if it's because they have multiple and chronic exposures to things that cause stress over stress over stress over stress. So that's the difference between acute stress and post-traumatic stress. The important thing to know from that is that every response that your body experiences is a result of what your brain stem is doing to take care of you. Your brain stem is the part of your brain that is the deepest part of your brain, the part of our brain that we don't think about. This is the part of our brain that is responsible for our heartbeat, for our respiration, for our temperature control, the things in our body that take care of themselves. So we don't think about breathing, we don't think about our muscles contracting, we don't think about our heart rate increasing. It happens for us depending upon what our experience is like. So we're going to shift over to talk a little bit about brain development, and we'll talk about how the brain stem kind of plays into brain development and why, depending upon what a child or an adolescent or an adult's experience is like, impacts the way their body feels and the way ultimately that their body responds. So for our purposes of this, we're going to use our hands to talk about the brain. And it's not real important to know the specific names of the brain structures for this. I think what's most important is to understand the concept. So for this, I just want you to kind of think about your right hand or your right fist as being one part of your brain. And the first part of your brain to develop in utero is actually your spinal cord. So if you think about your arm here being your spinal cord and the first part of your brain to develop, that's connected to where your wrist would be. Your wrist would actually be your brain stem, the part of your brain that we just talked about that's responsible for all things related to physiology, the things that you don't think about. This is what people call the deepest part of our brain. Okay, or some people call it the reptilian brain or the most primitive part of our brain. This part of your brain is definitely there in utero. So can an infant sense temperature? Yes, in utero. And can an infant hear in utero? Yes, there's lots of research that talks about reading to your child or having your child listen to music before even birth is very beneficial, or they'll recognize those sounds of certain voices or sounds of certain nursery rhymes or songs that they have heard. Is there a heartbeat? Absolutely, there's a heartbeat. When we first go to our OB visit, we want to hear a heartbeat. So the brain stem is very much intact. In utero, the next part of the brain to develop is what we call our sensory brain. So kind of your right fist. This doesn't mean it's the right side of your brain. It just means that it's the deepest part of your brain here. This part of your brain is fully developed at birth. So at birth, you've got your spinal cord, your brain stem that have been there all along, and then a very developed middle brain or sensory brain. This part of your brain is actually responsible for 3 basic things. It does a whole lot more, but for our purposes, think about these 3 basic things. We want to think about it as being responsible for sensations, for affect regulation, and for memory. So let's think about sensations for 1 second. So what are our sensations? Our sensations are things like sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, right? Can an infant sense those things at birth? Yes. They do hearing tests in the hospital. An infant can see their visual acuity continues to develop, but they can see contrasting shapes and colors, especially the features of their parents' or caregivers' faces. Can they smell? Yes, they can pick out their mother's scent from 10 other mothers. Can they feel? Absolutely. When they get their first heel stick, they cry, right? So they can hear, they can smell, they can see, they can feel that sense of touch. Can they taste? Yes, and that's why formula is formulated to taste like sweet, fatty breast milk. So we've got this sensory part of our brain connected to our brainstem, right, and our spinal cord. Now the second part of this brain part, the function of it, is related to affect regulation. So affect regulation is really, really tied to our sensations. So let's think for a minute, what happens or what could happen to an infant when they get stressed, or what could kind of rock their affect regulation or ability to stay regulated? It's typically things related to sensation. They're hot, they're cold, they're hungry, right? They don't see their mom's face, right? They feel something that feels maybe scratchy or itchy on their skin. Or maybe if they're dysregulated and they see the bottle or the pacifier close by, they start to calm down. They see the mother or father's face close by, they start to calm down. So there's this little dance here between sensation and affect regulation. Well, there's a third really important piece in this part of the brain, and it's the function of memory. So how many times do we respond to an infant in the course of the first couple weeks of their life? And some people say hundreds, some people say thousands, some people say constantly. So every time there's a dysregulation in affect because of a certain sensation, and the parent or caregiver responds, that creates a memory for that infant. So there's really this beautiful dance between sensation, affect regulation, and memory that happens over and over and over again. If that happens and it's consistent and the infant knows that they can trust, when they're hungry, mom comes and it calms me down. Or when I'm cold, mom gives me the blanket and then I can calm down. They create a memory. So it's the repetitive nature of those interactions that creates a deep neuronal connection that gives that infant or that child kind of a body memory that they can trust what they need to happen is going to happen. Remember that the affect regulation is very much connected to the brainstem. So when somebody becomes dysregulated, what happens in their brainstem? Their brainstem will turn on, in sense, it's a stress response, right? And it will begin to do things like increase heart rate, increase respiration, and that's when you see an infant maybe crying or squirming, screaming out, maybe arching their back, have sort of a more of a heavy breathing. This is exactly what happened when we almost rear-ended the car in front of us. So an infant being hungry is essentially the same thing as a stress response to us as adults. So we look at this as sensation, affect regulation, and memory. So let's take a second to think about if an infant is having a stress response or a dysregulation and they don't always have a response, right, to calm that sensation, what begins to happen? So if sometimes mom doesn't come when the infant cries, or if sometimes the child doesn't have access to food, or if sometimes they're not attended to, they're forming these disjointed memories that sometimes when I'm stressed out, somebody will come and relieve my stress, but sometimes that they won't. So that creates kind of a disconnect in that deep neuronal connection, and that's what we call stressed attachment. So it's not a real secure attachment where that child knows and they can expect what's coming next. So this part of the brain, this deep middle part of the brain, or what we call the sensory brain, really is intact at birth, but it continues to develop and it gets more and more fine-tuned, especially during the first several years of life. This part of the brain is really the foundation for our ability as adults to be able to regulate ourselves, to be able to soothe ourselves, to be able to calm ourselves. So let's just think about ourselves for a minute. What do we do as adults when we get stressed? So let's say we're hungry and we're in a meeting and we're looking at the clock and it's only 11 and the meeting's going till 12:30, right? What happens with our affect or our regulation? Our brainstem is sending a message, you're hungry. You start to maybe get shaky, you start to maybe get nervous, you start to think, oh, when's the break, when's the break, when's the break? But maybe you have a memory that this boss of yours always is going to give you at least one bathroom break. Might calm you down to know I can go grab a snack. I can go grab a drink of water. But if you don't have that memory, or sometimes she gives you a break, sometimes she doesn't, you're going to be squirming in your seat while you wait, right? What makes you feel better, right? What can make you feel better when you're stressed out? You find things to do in the meeting to keep yourself regulated. But let's say you've never learned how to keep yourself calm or regulated. You might start to get really antsy, really anxious, maybe thinking like, my blood sugar's dropping, I really need to get some food, and you may really kind of come undone or come unraveled and not be very productive or a part of the meeting. Some people may just have to get up and leave because they can't even take it any longer. So this part of our brain really is setting the foundation for the rest of our life and our ability to regulate and soothe ourselves. So let's kind of take this part of the brain here and think about this next part of the brain. And the next part of our brain is the part of our brain that begins to develop after birth. And that's our left brain or our thinking brain. So remember, we've got our sensory brain that's responsible for sensation, affect regulation, and memory. Okay, very connected to our brainstem. And then at birth, the left brain begins to develop. The first part of this brain that begins to develop is where your fingertips would be, right here, and that's your motor function. So your motor function develops first, holding your head up, sitting up, scooting, crawling, walking. Is the child talking yet? No, right? Can the child do math problems yet? No, right? So the motor piece is first. And then where my top knuckles are, that's the Broca's area, which is responsible for language. Happens about 18 months, where that child begins to get access to language, right? They start to be able to recognize and say, that's a ball, this is mom, this is dad, that's Cookie Monster, this is Elmo. Then this part of the brain continues to develop and develop and develop and isn't even fully developed until the very end of adolescence. So this part of the brain starts developing at birth, and it takes until about the age of 23 to fully develop. This part of the brain is responsible for higher level thinking. So 2 + 2 is 4. If I miss the bus, I better go to the office and call my mom and say that I missed the bus, I need to find another ride home, right? And then it gets into even higher level thinking functions like decision making, impulse control, being able to really problem solve and think things through. So that part of the brain is housed in this wrist, and that would be your prefrontal cortex. So let's kind of get back to what we talked about when we almost ran into the car in front of us. So here's our brain, we're driving to work, right? And it's very well integrated. Maybe we're thinking about what we need to do at work while we're listening to music, and then we have to slam on our brakes. Our brainstem becomes immediately activated. We don't even think about it, right? Our body senses that danger, and before we think about it, it sends a signal to the rest of our brain to get ready, right? To be on alert. And it heightens these three things, right? So we have a sensation, right, in our body based upon what our physiology is telling us. Oh my gosh, I see this car in front of me. It's so close. I almost hit it. My chest is heavy. I'm breathing really fast. I'm sweaty. I'm nervous. That affects your affect regulation, and it could be very much tied to memories you've had in the past. So maybe you had an accident in the past. Maybe you're looking in your rearview mirror and you remember being rear-ended before. Maybe you're thinking about how you got in trouble as a child when you totaled your car and your parent was yelling at you, right? Are you thinking? No, because this surge from your brainstem actually pops this part of your brain and it's gone. So you're here, okay? So in stress, we're here. And we're here in acute stress and we're here in post-traumatic stress. But if this stress and that surge of adrenaline is there, like I said, prolonged and exaggerated, you have little access to this part of the brain. So what do we not have access to? We don't have a lot of access to our motor control. And you often hear that people say, I was so scared I couldn't move, right? Or maybe they were so scared that all they could do was flee. They just ran because they were so scared. But again, not thinking about it. They were being driven by the brainstem. What else is over here? Our access to language. Language becomes very inaccessible when we're stressed out. So some people will say, well, what did you say? Or why didn't you ask this question when you were at the doctor's office? And they'll say, I didn't even think about it. I didn't know to say that, or I was so mad that I couldn't even speak. That access to language goes away. And then the final thing that we're missing is really decision-making, problem-solving, and impulse control. So you can see that in stress, people often say, like, I just wasn't thinking clearly, I wasn't making a good decision, I had too many things on my plate, and too many things coming at me at once, I missed it, I didn't even see that part of what was in that report, I completely missed that piece. So there's two things that are happening in trauma. There is a surge or an overactivation of the brainstem, and there's a complete disconnect to our ability to really make sense out of what is happening and make good decisions to try to calm that piece down. Now, if a child has had a really nice birth to 5 years old, and they had a really beautiful dance here where they had a parent or a caregiver really respond, this part of the brain can be really intact. They probably will have a better time regulating, but even in trauma, even if we have had a good attachment experience, this part of the brain is so overactive that we are heightened to sensation, we are already dysregulated, and we are remembering the things that have happened before that kind of frame the way we view other people or see ourselves in the world. So we really have to look at that heightened sensation where people are, kids and adults alike may be very acutely aware of sights or sounds or smells that could be not dangerous at all, but to them they see as maybe a potential threat. So there's a little piece in this part of the brain where my thumb is, and that's called your amygdala. And the amygdala is sort of like a smoke detector. And you can see here, it's very connected to our sensation, right? Our amygdala is the first line or the first thing that senses something that sends that signal to the brainstem. So when we're almost going to rear end the car in front of us, it's our little amygdala that had our brain get going, right? Smell, sight, touch. Now, you know how smoke detectors sometimes go off when there's nothing really wrong? Like you could be making pancakes, nothing's burning, but all of a sudden your smoke detector's going off. The amygdalas of traumatized kids or very stressed out individuals are larger and more sensitive than those of non-stressed or non-traumatized people. And that is why they seem to go off at anything, even if there's nothing they need to go off about. So we've got a lot of dynamics working here together. If you see this disconnect, you see that it's because of this arousal or this activation of stress. And that's what gives us very little access to this part of our brain that allows us to really think things through, talk things through, make meaning, make sense out of things. So our number one goal is really to calm the brainstem. So can we just talk to a child? Can we just put a behavior modification plan together for a child? Can we just ask that child to really think through and make a better decision next time they act out or respond to something inappropriately? Typically, those strategies or interventions kind of fall short of what that traumatized child needs. And what they really need first is somebody to meet them here. And this is really why we call trauma a sensory experience or a body experience, because it's the physiology of the body, or really of the brain stem, really kicking off all of the other things that are happening in the body and in how that child responds. This too is really what we need to think about when we think about how trauma impacts a child in terms of how they behave, how they interact with others, how they can manage their emotions, how they can build relationships, and how they can learn. So we think about learning in particular. How can a child learn if they're here and they don't have access over here? So the key is to reduce that arousal, and the way we can reduce that arousal is to use interventions or strategies that really target the deep part of our brain, so working at the sensory level and at the body level. So some of the interventions that we do at TLC are mind-body related, so like breathing, breath work, mindfulness, guided imagery, relaxation, and then we can get into the sensory pieces like expressive arts and music and dance and drawing and collage. Only then, when we get over here at this part of the sensory brain, are we able to really pull in the cognitive part of the brain that helps that child really make meaning or put words to what their experience has been like.